Isaiah 38 starting out this evening. When we get to the main section of the lesson, we're going to do a little bit of review and finish off on a few things that we didn't have time to cover on Sunday with regard to chapter 37 there right at the end. But then we'll be starting in chapter 38. Okay, we've talked about this point of the division between Isaiah, the chapters, with regard to historical outline. The first part, the first 39 chapters, in the Assyrian period, and then the second section of that, starting with chapter 40, going through chapter 66, during the Babylonian period, or looking to that. It's not written during the Babylonian period. Remember, that doesn't come about until after the death of Isaiah, but it's dealing with that time when they'll go into captivity, then they'll be able to come back out of captivity. He's going to name during this section Cyrus as the one who would be the deliverer. So over 150 years before it takes place, you have the name of the one who's going to deliver them from Babylonian captivity and bring them back into the land. And so this is the section we'll start on Sunday morning, Lord willing. We've dealt with the first 12 chapters of the Discourse of the Prophecies with regard to Jerusalem and Judah and the nations that are there, how the foreign nations, it was pointed out, that they're going to suffer, even though they were the ones that God brought against Israel and Judah. They were the ones that he used to discipline them and to judge them, yet they were not going to get off the hook. They were going to be dealt with ultimately by God because they had done that which was evil. So the question of whether or not God would deal with them as he had dealt with his people, the fact is that he would, and even more severely, because both of Babylon and Assyria were pointed out as those that would go down. They would be destroyed, and they never would come back again. Both of the cities of Nineveh and Babylon have never been rebuilt, even to this day, just as God had declared. We looked at the world judgments versus the salvation of God's people, that God always held his people to a way of being forgiven and made right if they would be obedient to him. He extended to them a special protection. But what happened to them if they would not obey? Do what? All right, judgment. They would be ones that would be judged and brought into the woes there. In that section where he deals with the woes, the 6 woes, as were pointed out there during that next section, chapters 28 through 35, and chapter 28 through 33 itself, the woes are pronounced upon those who were of Judah and also the nations because of what would happen to them. And then God especially points out the destiny, the difference between Edom and Israel. Why Edom? Who were they? What was particularly bad about what Edom did? They come from whom? Go ahead. All right, they came from Esau, so what would you expect them to be like in dealing with Israel? All right, they were brotherly. They should have been in that way. What were they? Anything but. They did that which was evil in the way of God. They did that which was evil to those of Israel, and they were particularly ones that God looked at. That's why it was that he was going to bring them to an end, but he was going to chastise Israel and then bring them back. We're on this section now dealing with the historical part. Having looked at chapters 36 and 37 last time, Sennacherib's attempt to come into Jerusalem and to overtake it. And that's where we're going to begin for a little while this evening. You remember Sennacherib had tried to come into Jerusalem, tried to overcome it, but as Rabshakeh, who was the leader of the army, came there, what kind of letter did he write? What kind of threat did he make? Who did he especially call into question? God. All right. How? All right. The idea that was there, their gods out there in those other countries, they can't save their group. You think your God can? Your God's no better than them. And the idea was that when he did that, what Hezekiah do? Rabshakeh put it down, or Sennacherib's letter put it down into writing. All right, put it out there before God so that it could be seen. And as a result of that, that letter was seen in such a way that God had pointed out that he would bring about this destruction that was there upon them. I want to especially get into that last part when you have in that last few verses of chapter 37, the statements that are made in verse 36, the angel of the Lord went forth and smote how many of the camp of Assyria? 185,000. I want you to think about that a minute. How many dead bodies is that? You ever been to a game where there's, say, 30 or 40,000 people joined together? That's a lot of people, right? You ever been to one with over 100,000? Very few stadiums would hold that. 185,000 people slain in the night by the power of God. The rest of them, however many are left, what happens with them? Do what? Okay. Wonder why. I wouldn't want to attack after that, would you? Number one, you got a lot of your people dead. Number two, you got a lot of your people dead. I mean, having died in the middle of the night, and the point is, hey, I want to get out of here as quick as I can. And that's exactly what they do. They get out and they go back home. We're told in the historical books about some people who had leprosy. They had decided, well, if we stay where we are, we're going to die, we're going to starve to death. If we go into Jerusalem, they'll kill us because we got leprosy. And number two, they don't have any food anyway, so we'll die that way. So here's our only chance. We're going to go to the camp of the Assyrians, and maybe they'll take pity on us and feed us. And what did they find? All the camp people are dead, and all the food is left. And that's how it is that those in Jerusalem came to know of what was there and were able to eat. The promise had been made to Hezekiah the day before by Isaiah. As God has said, he said, you are going to have bread at normal price, at the same price tomorrow about this time. Well, when Hezekiah pointed that out to the people, and Isaiah did to Hezekiah, how believable would you think that was just at face value? That's impossible. What were they eating? Jeremiah had pointed that out. Hope most of you have had supper and had a chance to digest it. They were eating the dung of animals and then their own because it was so bad. And with that being the place that was there, such a desperate place, now tomorrow, about this time, you're going to find out that food's at normal prices. Everything's in abundance. And that's exactly what happened. Why? Because God said so. All of the preparations that were made by the people up to that point, what part did they play in overtaking this army? None. God played that part. That's one of the reasons, as Jeremiah pointed out on Sunday, when there was a failure by Hezekiah to ask what he should have done in preparation. God had a plan in mind, and that's exactly what he executed in that way. Notice, if you will, though, in verse 37 of chapter 37, so Sennacherib, king of Assyria, departed and went and returned and dwelt at Nineveh. And it came to pass, as he was worshiping in the house of Nisroch, his god, that Adramelech and Shazar, his son, smote him with the sword, and they escaped into the land of Ararat. And Esarhaddon, his son, reigned in his stead. There's an interesting point that is made out of the cylinder that Jeremiah brought up on Sunday, and that was that there was no kind of statement about them taking Jerusalem. That's true. But it also very clearly in their annals and also in that cylinder points out of the death of Sennacherib. And not in a way that was explained. Didn't have any victory associated with it. And the second thing was, you didn't have Assyria according to their own statements. You didn't have them go out and do another attempt at conquest for about 20 years after this point. And you can date it to this particular time. Wonder why that was. If your army gets decimated with 185,000, how long is it going to take you to replace that? All right. Because part of that's going to be those who had as their most trusted of the officers in battle. That's who was going to be a part of this whole thing. And just if you say, okay, half of that gets decimated. Now, I'd say it's probably in excess of that, but let's just say that's what it was. Then how are you going to ever get that to be brought back up in a time of 5 or 10 years? How long does it take you to redo an officer's corps? That's one of the things that Stalin learned in World War II. After the purges that were made of a great deal of his leaders, in comes Hitler with all of his armies, and they're absolutely blasted. Why? Well, because most of those guys were put to death by Stalin in his purges. It took a while for there to be any effort made at all of bringing the ones from the other areas outside of Moscow to be those who would be taking over any charge of the army at all. Ask any army person, they're going to tell you this is going to be a devastating thing to an army, and it's devastating to Sennacherib personally, because after all, he doesn't do very well. He assumes room temperature pretty clearly and quickly after all of this happens. He's killed by his own sons, and then one of the sons that didn't flee from the place is made to be king in his stead. Anybody got any questions there? Anybody at all? Okay, go ahead. Oh, not what that I know of. All you've got is the cases from 2 Kings, 2 Chronicles. And there isn't any more information given there. Go ahead. I'm not aware of real clear evidence on how many there would have been total, but this would have been a major chunk of any army. Do that to 185,000 of our troops today, and you've got a sizable mess that's made. All right, anything else there? Okay. Now, in chapter 38, we start to read about what takes place with Hezekiah as far as his illness. In verse 1, in those days Hezekiah was sick and in near death. And Isaiah the prophet, the son of Amoz, went to him and said to him, Thus says the Lord, Set your house in order, for you shall die and not live. Then Hezekiah turned his face towards the wall and prayed to the Lord, and said, Remember now, O Lord, I pray, how I have walked before you in truth and with a loyal heart, and have done what is good in your sight. And Hezekiah wept bitterly. The word of the Lord came to Isaiah, saying, Go and tell Hezekiah, Thus says the Lord, the God of David your father, I have heard your prayer, I have seen your tears. Surely I will add to your days 15 years. And I will deliver you and this city from the hand of the king of Assyria, and I will defend this city. This is the sign to you from the Lord, that the Lord will do this thing which he has spoken. Behold, I will bring the shadow on the sundial, which has gone down with the sun on the sundial of Ahaz 10 degrees backward. So the sun returned 10 degrees on the dial by which it had gone down. Okay, let's start off with this first part that is here. Again, you can get the parallel information where? In, Second Chronicles 32 and Second Kings what? 20. All right, that's where you're going to find this. 18 and 19 were the last two chapters of Isaiah. Now 20, 2 Kings 20, is going to deal with this part. So he's told that he's going to die. Jeremiah brought up a point on Sunday that there is some question with regard to the time factor, the chronology, as to when this sickness takes place. What'd you think in your study? What would you see about when this happened? Any indication of something telling you for certain of exactly when this would take place in the life of Hezekiah? Nobody wants to step out there on that one? Okay. In those days, which could mean what? All right, during the time that had just been talked about, in other words, during the time of the period of them going into this defense of Jerusalem, when Sennacherib and those of Assyria are threatening, what else, though? Is that the only possibility? I don't think that's the case that you've got myself, and I will admit there's not something that I could say this is absolutely definitive. But it seems to me that the in those days time frame goes back to the point of after the death of Sennacherib, that you have the beginning of the reign of his son, and now he is getting to be sick. And it also would fit with the idea later on you're going to have the Babylonian king send an embassage unto Hezekiah. And during this particular time of the start of that assault against Jerusalem, Hezekiah, or those in Babylon, would not have been ones who would have been powerful enough to have any reasonable embassage that they could bring against them. And here you have something where they seem to be of some power, and now some alliance seems to be in mind by Hezekiah. That wouldn't have been so at the very beginning of when Assyria was threatening Jerusalem. It seems to me it's the latter case that takes place of after the death of Sennacherib taking place. Whatever the fact, you have Hezekiah being told, you're going to have to get your house in order because what's going to happen? All right. You are going to die and not live. Was that what ended up happening? We got a thought question down there. How do you explain that? That God is always true, and yet He says you're going to die and not live, and yet He lived and did not die at that time. Go ahead, Ronnie. All right. If you have a Calvinistic view of God's sovereignty, you've got a problem with this. Calvinists talk about the idea God has determined everything that is there. Calvin made a statement at one point that God had determined everything down to every leaf that falls from a tree as to when it would happen and how it would happen. It's an absolute idea of God's sovereignty that cannot be touched with anything. Yet God teaches that His children can come to Him in prayer and that God will consider their prayer, and at times He will change His will. What other case do you know of like that? All right, Moses with regard to the people. What else? Do what? All right, Abraham. You remember Paul when he was on the journey to Rome? He told them, if you leave this place, there's not only going to be a loss of the ship, but what else? Be a great loss of life as well. And yet what happened? In the end, he told them, God has given me the lives of all those here if you remain with the ship. And the point is that He has given me that. The very obvious point is Paul had prayed and God had granted the prayer, even though God's original intent was to bring about much death. As a result of that, Paul prayed and that changed the will of God. There you have the idea of God's sovereignty mixed with God's desire to benefit His people, His ability to be touched by the infirmity of His people. And so we recognize prayer, if it were the idea of Calvinism, prayer would be a useless exercise. There would be absolutely no purpose to prayer, since God could not change anything at all. Yet prayer is given a place where the effectual, fervent prayer of a righteous man, what? Avails much. That can happen, and we need to remember that. That can only happen if you recognize that God's will can be swayed by man in these certain areas. Go ahead. That's right. That's right. God does not judge them at that time. All right. I see a hand somewhere? Okay. When you look at that then, that God says, I will lengthen your days, how long? All right, 15 years. What would you think about that? If you were given, okay, you're not going to die right now, you're going to die 15 years from now. Okay. But we know God's prayer can alter His will. Okay, go ahead. He is thankful. I'm also wondering just exactly, though we're not told, is that a blessing that He always saw as a blessing? I'm not too sure I want to know exactly when I'm going to die. That's one of those things that may be a blessing, but a mixed blessing in that sort of a sense. But here He's told you have these 15 years. What do we know happened during that 15 years? All right. Manasseh was born, and what happened as a result to the kingdom of Manasseh's birth during that time? All right. Be careful what you ask for. There are things that take place during this that I think we're intended to God intends for us to recognize that not all was a benefit. Not all to Hezekiah, and certainly not all to Judah was a benefit, because Manasseh is said to be the worst of all the kings. When you look at his life and what he did and the terrible way that he was in comparison to his father, you recognize what's pointed out in the book of Ezekiel. Ezekiel talks about the fact that you have a righteous man and he has a wicked son. And this wicked son is responsible for himself. That righteous father is responsible for himself. If I'm not mistaken, what Ezekiel seems to be having in mind is that kingship. That as you look over the last few kings, that's exactly what he's describing. A good king who has a bad son, a bad king who has a good son. Ahaz was about as evil as you could get, only topped by Manasseh a little bit later. But you got him being evil, but his son Hezekiah being good. And so you recognize that either one of those is possible as it took place in that particular case. All right, he's told you you'll have this 15 years. Now he says, but I'll save you from this city, from the hand of the Assyrians, and I'll protect this city. Well, he had already done that, right? Why is that said? Was it possible for them to come back again? Sure it was. But the point is, God had provided for that not to happen during that time as well. And also, he was raising up the Babylonians during this time. That by the time you come down to about 612, you have the Battle of Carchemish. And at that time, the power totally shifted. After the Battle of Carchemish, Assyria was totally brought down into nothing. And Babylon was the power in ascendancy at that time, and they took over from that point. Then in 606 BC, 607, you have them coming down and taking Jerusalem and taking away the captives in that first captivity. All right. Anything else there about the sickness and recovery of Hezekiah? Okay. How about this next part in verse 9 and following, the writing of Hezekiah while he was in illness and recovery? I don't want to go through and read all of that. We don't have time. But what do you notice about it? What are some points you see out of that Hezekiah writes? Part of this is said to be a time, I forgot there, part of this is said to be a time of thanksgiving, but it also gives very clear indication of his grief during this time, that God had said he was going to die and not live. What do you notice about it? Any thoughts that you have as you read through? Okay. Now, let's look at that, because you see a lot of those points that here I am, I've done all of these good things, and yet you tell me I'm going to die. You know, it's that I'm taken away in the very middle of my life during the part that I have some good to give. Why is that so? And so there's an element that is in there of him looking at that and the grief over that death. Now, is all of that something that's necessarily him showing a lack of faith? What did he have a responsibility as king to do? To lead the people in a way of right. Had he done that? What had been there of the kingdom before he came along? Been involved in idolatry. He had put the places of idolatry away, and now he had brought that kingdom around. The good side of looking at that would be to see a possible, give the benefit of the doubt, I guess, to Hezekiah. They're looking at that and seeing his concept could also be that I haven't finished the good that I wanted to do. I'm afraid of that going back over into evil. Whether he looked at his sons and he recognized where there would be a departure going back to that, or whether it is that he recognized what had been there before and the tendency of a group to go back to what had been there before. You can't look at this and say, okay, he was totally faithless, and this prayer is an example of faithlessness. I've seen that said a lot of times, and I don't believe that's so. You have to look at his point that he had a responsibility on both sides of that. Go ahead. Yeah, during a time of responsibility, there's those kinds of thoughts in man's eyes. I've noticed as my parents got older, and especially as Mom got up into her 90s and was just not able to do much of anything, the recognition that it's time for me to go. Now I can't do what I used to do. I can't be of benefit to the kingdom anymore in various ways. And the point that I'm ready to go on, there gets to be a point of suffering that's involved in that as well. And so you look at this, and it depends on where someone is in that continuum. But what you see with Hezekiah was he was in what he called, or what he refers to pretty much as the prime of his life, during the time in which he could have an influence. So let's remember that part as well as the other. Go ahead, Vernon. Yeah. From the point of view of the older person, I think they see that they've run out of that place, even though that's not true many times. It's true. All right. Go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. Right. I want to make it clear. I didn't intend to say that all of it was good and altruistic about his point. I'm saying there's a mix of the two, that both of those are there to some degree that you have. All right. Now, when you get down to the end of chapter 38, I don't want to go into a bunch of boring textual criticism points, but some of the things that we have from copies of Isaiah from the Dead Sea Scrolls have let us have a look at the text and what it was, and it moves it back by almost 2,000 years from the earliest text we had before that time, or maybe a tad longer than that. And in many of those texts where this part of Isaiah is quoted, Isaiah 38, 21, and 22 take place back up into the text further, back in the story that is going there at first, like it is back in the historical case, or the historical books as well. The point about putting the figs, the cake of figs upon the boil that's there, and the sign being asked for, that's back in the points where you would expect that to be in the particular story that takes place there. So some of this is, the wording is still correct, but the placement is somewhat of a question, and seems to be one that for some reason is out of place here, although it's obvious where it belongs. And in the Dead Sea Scrolls that take place, some of those are very clear with regard to the placement of these particular facts. What part did the putting of the cake of figs on the boil have to do with his healing? Is that what did it? Okay. You have the point that this is fatal. If all it took was a cake of figs to be put on the boil and then it happened in a naturalistic way, there would be a recognition that, well, this wasn't so bad as what they had said. This just takes place naturally. That's what some of the naturalists say about this. But that's certainly not what you get when you look at this story. Let me connect that back with an earlier part. When he asked for the proof of how this disease, that he knew this disease was going to be overcome and his life would be extended, God said, I'll give you this sign. What is it? That you have 10 steps backward on the sundial. Anybody want to tell me how that happened naturalistically? Or, not naturalistically, but let's say, okay, how did God do it miraculously? I can't answer that question either. If you took this earth and you suddenly stopped it and reversed it, went back 10 degrees on the dial, what would happen? You would have a catastrophe of tsunamis that you had never seen the like of, nor will. You can't have that kind of a body in motion and then reverse it without some effects that took place. Okay, let's say the earth stood still then, since that would cause a massive problem there, and God moved the sun instead of the earth. Now what problems we got? Now we got problems that are even worse than moving the earth around there. You can't get that. What happened to the rest of the solar system? Everything else that's there. I can't tell you how this happened, and that's why it's a miracle. It happened by God's power. And it can't happen according to natural law. That's the definition of a miracle. And yet what we see many times, those who are skeptics who try to make this as something that takes place according to natural law, you can't do that. Or you make absolute nonsense of this. Okay, next part of this from the next chapter, in chapter 39, what mistake does Hezekiah make? Showing what? Showing all of his treasures. Did he ask God about that? Nope. What did God tell him through Isaiah? All right, as a result of you doing that, it's going to be taken away from you. Those Babylonians are going to come back in here into this city. They're going to take all of that and they're going to take it to their place. And that's exactly what we find happen as you look at it later on down the line, about 150 years later. That's the case that takes place of all of this happening. Or about 100 years later, pardon me. That you have all of these things taking place. Anything else there on this part? Let's see. Isaiah told Hezekiah, thus says the, set your house in, for you shall, and not, okay. In praying to God, what did Hezekiah ask God to remember about him? All right, all the good that he had done. What was God's answer to the prayer of Hezekiah? All right, lengthened his life for 15 years. What was the sign given? Turning the dial back 10 degrees. Summarize the thought. Well, we've already done that one. That one too. Upon the recovery of Hezekiah, what king sent a letter and a present to him? Okay. Merodach Baladan, who was the king of Babylon. All right. And Merodach, incidentally, is a title. You'll find many of the Babylonian leaders called Merodach. It's kind of like what you would say with Pharaoh. It was a title among those of the Babylonians. Okay, got the sheets up here, questions for Sunday morning. Pick those up and get them ready for our class then.